Hi everyone, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Adrian McCallum and today I'm going to speak with you briefly about the outcomes of research that I was fortunate to progress with Patrick Nunn over about the last 12 months, and that research was kindly supported by USC's Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre. So our research was entitled Walking to Gari. So, of course, none of that research was possible without the support of our Indigenous collaborators. So I'd like to thank the Gubbi Gubbi people, the Butchulla people, the Darumbal people, and the Wapawara people for enabling us to have access to stories within their communities. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, because it was only from conversations with some of these elders that we were able to piece together the story that I'm about to share with you now. So where did it all start? Well, our proposal essentially, at least in my mind, hinged on Patrick's book, which some of you might have read. It's called The Edge of Memory. And essentially that title suggests that we're moving back through human memory, Indigenous memory, to those vestiges of stories and memories that are still just there. So we're trying to capture what stories have been passed down generation to generation, because of course, far before everything was captured in writing, everything was captured orally. So there are many, many stories and many things that we probably should be far more aware of that are probably disappearing as the oral record is lost. So Patrick's book specifically touched on how sea level rise over the last thousands of years has changed the land upon which we live, and also upon which Indigenous people and their elders live. So if we look at the Australian context, Patrick identified more than 20 sites around Australia where after the last glacial maximum and as sea level rose, then of course areas of Australia that once were land started being swallowed up by the ocean. So Patrick identified alignment there between what happened geologically or physically and the stories that were told by Indigenous people and their elders and were handed down. So there were at least 20 cases here you can see documented around the country where Patrick was able to date those stories by looking at when those actual sea level rise events occurred at these various locations around the country. What you might note here, though, is there's a lack of information in central and southern Queensland. Yes, we've got Moreton and North Stradbroke Islands there, but not much else is apparent up until the Hitchinbrook and Palm Islands, but there's quite a bit of land there. So that was essentially the catalyst for this research, to look at those areas and say, well, I wonder if there's some stories there that we haven't quite taken the time to listen to just yet. So our work focuses on two areas. To the south there, I've circled Gari, and to the north, the Great Keppel Islands, the Keppel Island group. So they're the two areas that we'll focus on in this brief talk today. So zooming in a bit more, here's the southern end of Gari, and particularly you can see the Great Sandy Straits, which separate Gari from the mainland. And there's a multitude of islands filling those straits. And just for context, there's no scale on this map, I apologise, but the width of the Great Sandy Straits in the middle there is about 7 or 8 kilometres from the mainland, where about Scarden Island is, across to Gari. And if we look at the Keppel group, Curtis Island is quite close to the mainland to the south there, and to the north, the Keppel group generally is somewhat further offshore from Yeppoon, Emu Park, etc. than Gari is off the mainland. But again, we'll present some stories that suggest that swimming and walking, and perhaps walking only, was once possible from the mainland out to the Keppel Islands. So what we did, well, we started as we should with a literature review, desktop analysis of what information was out there, and we did that from USC. And then after that, I was fortunate to take a couple of days to go down to Canberra to look at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and they have a wonderful archive. So I spent a couple of days there jotting down notes and taking some photographs, some images, etc., to further enrich our story and our findings. But of course, that's just part of the effort. The main thing that we're trying to understand was whether there were some oral histories that described walking to Gari and across to the Keppels. So we had some wonderful conversations, both face-to-face in person where possible, and also via email with Gubbi Gubbi elders, Butchulla elders, Wapawara elders, trying to tease out some of their history, the oral histories that have been passed down over generations that we could learn from today. And then finally, only in the last month or so, dodging COVID lockdowns, etc., I had the opportunity to head north to Hervey Bay and then south via the coast to look at these areas with my own eyes and get a feel for just how it might have once been possible to walk to Gari, say. Okay, so what did we find? So we'll talk about Gari initially. So as I said, it was fascinating what we did found and some of the reading that we did. So there's a picture on the right here. I apologise for its clarity. This is from a poor photograph I took at the archives. But Devitt, 1979, in her honours thesis on habitation of Gari and the mainland by the Butchulla people, suggested that travel from Gari to the mainland was affected by numerous points. And you can see those on the map here in these solid arrowed lines. Across from the Mary River, down south from Inskip Point, dotted suggesting via canoe. But the point I'd like to highlight is this area in the middle. It's a bit hard to read, I apologise, but there's the town of Boonaroo and there's the town of Maroom, and you can see two crossing points there via specifically the Moonboom Islands. So the Moonboom Islands will come up in future supporting evidence. And if we look briefly at the text too, between Fraser Island and Boonaroo, there's a complex of mudflats and sandbars which can be waded across at low tide. So highly suggestive that yes, Indigenous people did wander across from Maroom, thereabouts, across to Gari, particularly at low tide, across this series of islands in the middle of the Great Sandy Straits. If we look at another map, no supporting text on this slide. If we look at this map by Green, 1979, now Green was recounting or capturing stories of his grandfather from the early 1900s who had listened to and spent time with Indigenous people, the Butchulla people. And this map, it's obscured again, I apologise because of the photograph I took down at IATSIS, but you can see the Moonboom Islands at the very top of this picture, and the word is cropped off, but just north of Moonboom Islands is the word ford. So Green Elder in the early 1900s recorded that this area to the north of the Moonboom Islands was used as a ford to cross from the mainland to Gari, and that's in the same location as on the previous map that we saw. So this is pretty exciting where we're getting historical documentary evidence that suggests that yes, it is expected that perhaps Butchulla people used to walk from the mainland across to Gari, across those Moonboom Islands or thereabouts. But the story gets better. Okay, when we had the chance to have a discussion with Glenn Miller, who's a Butchulla elder who lives in Maryborough and has spent most of his life in that area, Glenn got back to us via email with stories that he recalls from his elders. And as it says here, they would have walked from near Maroom out to the northern end of Moonboom Island on one low tide, waited essentially till the tide switched to the next low tide. And as he says, I don't believe the main channel dried out completely in those days, and they may have had to wade or swim a short distance. So this is fantastic. We've got oral evidence here from Glenn suggesting that, yes, as the literature suggests, his people used to wander from Maroom, thereabouts, via Moonboom Island, dependent on the tides, to eventually get across to Gari. And if we look at contemporary charts of the area, it's fascinating. Here's Maroom. Glenn suggests they used to leave just north of Maroom, probably across the bottom of Garden Island here, but you can see the L gutter. This is the 2021 chart, and the L gutter is there. So the L gutter is the place where the tides would meet. So if you were walking across here, then certainly it makes sense that you want to go when the tide is slack, and because the tide from the north and the tide from the south both meet there, then that makes sense that that's a very sensible place to cross with minimal tidal activity across these series of islands to Gari. So a fantastic number of stories that came together in the crossing from the mainland to Gari that substantiate that, yeah, right across about this point, we expect the crossings used to occur. So this is a contemporary photograph, took maybe a month ago. There's no scale on that, I apologise. This is from the site of Maroom, looking across to Gari. The distance across there is about 7 or 8 kilometres. Down to my right, or the right of the picture, is the creek coming out at Maroom, but to the left is Garden Island, and beyond that, out of sight because they're very low, are more and more islands, the Moonboom Islands, which are the islands that Indigenous Butchulla people could have walked across to get to Gari. And this is pretty much at low tide too. So you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the flats to the top left of the picture are almost reaching across to that island. So you can see how quite feasibly this would appear to be a pretty sensible crossing point to get across to Gari from the mainland. Okay, so that ends our brief description of what we found out with regards to Gari. Let's briefly look at the Keppel Islands and the stories of the Wapabara, who are the people of the Keppel Islands. So looking at this map, you can see we've got North Keppel out here, we've got Great Keppel here, and again some smaller islands in between the Keppels and the mainland, which suggests that, well, you know, maybe in times of lower sea level there was a chance to walk across that area. So let's see what we found in our research. So Roth, 1898, provides some great literary evidence from a couple of centuries ago now. And he says that following the indigenous people's involuntary removal from the Keppel Islands, many swam back a distance of at least 12 kilometres. So we've seen the map and you know, there you have it, evidence from Roth that people at least had the capacity and the knowledge to swim back across that distance from the mainland back to the Keppel Islands. Roth goes on further to describe the practice of log swimming. So I certainly couldn't swim 12 kilometres. Perhaps the Wapabara elders, of course, could, but perhaps they also utilised this log swimming technique, which Roth documents. And he's described it on the right there. The leader of the gang gets into the water, guides the timber with one hand, swims along with the other, and then the next person hangs on to that person, etc. And then away they go as a team. And the beauty of the log being that if everyone gets tired, then there's the chance, of course, to have a rest on the log before you crack on again. So wonderful to see this description from Roth, and this image is from Harry Van Issem's PhD thesis of the Wapabara people, which I'll speak about very shortly. Terrell also, in his work, suggests that a once common Wapabara phrase was, "I am walking in through the water." So this is part of the Wapabara lexicon, and the fact that that exists, at least to my mind, suggests that, well, there were times when they would be walking in and through the water, potentially crossing from the mainland across to the Keppel. So that was terrific to find. And then, as I mentioned, if we look at Dr. Harry Van Issem's PhD thesis, Harry is a Wapabara man. He suggests that there's an ancestral dreaming track involving a series of land as well as water crossings that exist between the Keppels and the mainland. So we didn't get the opportunity to gather first-hand oral evidence from the Wapabara. Unfortunately, we were unable to get up to Rockhampton to speak with Wapabara elders. But I hope you can see, as I and Patrick certainly did, that from the literature that's been collected of stories that do exist, it seems highly probable that either swimming and walking, or perhaps even walking alone, used to occur from the mainland across to the Keppels. So that's in brief what we found. So what did we do with it? What outputs did we generate from this ITRC grant? Well, we're fortunate to have contributed to one academic paper, which is currently with the journal. So Patrick was the lead author on this. I was fortunate to be included as an additional author. And as you can see, we had lots of collaborators, including Glenn Miller, Bachelor Elder, lots of collaborators both in Australia and around the world. And that's a paper titled Human Observations of Late Quaternary Coastal Change, Examples from Australia, Europe and the Pacific Islands. And that's been submitted to a special issue of Quaternary International. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll hear that that has been accepted. No guarantees, of course, but hopefully we'll be getting the stories out to an international audience. Second output, again, both Patrick and I are fortunate to be involved in a future IRC, which is currently under development, led by a lady in the Western Australia. So there's no guarantees again, but this IRC proposal is at a fairly mature stage of development, and the plan is to submit that in the new year. And that would hopefully enable us to be involved in the research of similar stories around Australia over the next couple of years. Finally, I'd like to give a big shout out of thanks again to the ITRC for supporting work that builds on this work that Patrick and I have just done. And what I'm going to do with another lady from USC, plus a colleague from the US, as well as Glenn Miller, Bachelor Elder, is do some more work in the Great Sandy Straits. So just briefly, that work will look at whether there is any submerged archaeological evidence in the Great Sandy Straits. There are midden mounds that have been found on Gari and on the mainland. Stone tools are evidence on some of the Moon Boom Islands. But what's kind of fascinating is that Glenn suggested that once agriculture occurred on the Mary River, a lot more silt occurred and essentially silted up the Great Sandy Straits. So the question is there other buried or submerged archaeological evidence in the Great Sandy Straits that's now buried by silt that we might be able to find using a sub-bottom profiler, which is essentially a depth sounder that we can mount on a small boat, do some laps across the Great Sandy Straits, and we might be able to pick up some evidence of now submerged Indigenous habitation on crossing routes from the mainland across to Gari. So I'm pretty excited about that research. It builds on this current research, which is terrific. The final symbol I've got on that slide is of the Kingfisher Bay Resort, and that's just because we're in discussion with Kingfisher Bay Resort as well. They would like researchers, academics to come and give public briefings or presentations to the public and to the guests of Kingfisher Bay Resort. So I'm hoping by the end of the year, perhaps over the summer, that I'll have the opportunity to go to Kingfisher Bay Resort and share this story, hopefully in more depth, with their guests and with the broader public on what we found about our research into walking to Gari. Okay, look, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your time today. I do appreciate that that was fairly rushed. If you do have any questions, Patrick will be with you for live answering of questions, I understand, later this week. But I'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure Patrick would as well. Our emails are there in the bottom of the slide. So thanks again for your time. Thanks again to our Indigenous collaborators. There's lots of information out there that we are very keen to hear and learn from your stories. So, and again, thanks to the ITRC for your support of what I think is pretty fascinating research, and I appreciate the opportunity to share that with you briefly today. Thank you all for your time. Bye.